So again, I'm Ashton Mara with Reporting on Addiction, and today's conversation is part of Reporting on Addiction's work to help journalists who are covering the opioid settlement funds in their communities. You can find more resources about those, including recordings of our previous fireside chats on our website, reportingonaddiction.org, and we'll drop those links for you in the chat here in a minute. So I want to say really quickly that today's conversation is meant for journalists, but we know that some folks joining us today might not be journalists, and that's totally okay. You are welcome here. But if you're not a journalist and you're interested in helping reporters who are covering this topic, we ask you to please share this recording. Please share our resources so that we can help improve the journalism in this space. So let's start with a quick introduction of our guests, and then we'll jump right into our conversation. And again, I'm going to keep this super, super brief, but Ed and Kate's bios are available if you want to learn more about them. So I'm going to start with Kate Giammarise, who is a reporter at 90.5 WESA in Pittsburgh. That's Pittsburgh's NPR station. And her reporting focuses on safety net issues such as social services and affordable housing. And then we also have with us today Ed Mahon, who is an investigative reporter with Spotlight PA, which is an independent nonprofit and nonpartisan newsroom dedicated to high-quality investigative reporting and public service journalism about the Pennsylvania state government and urgent statewide issues. So Kate and Ed, thank you again so much for being with us today, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Ashton. Thank you for the introduction too. So I'll just turn it over to Kate now.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. And our first slide, I just want to briefly explain why we wanted to partner together on these stories. Ed and I have known each other for quite a while. We used to cover the Capitol together many years ago, and we both cover, safety net and human services topics. And we knew that this was going to be a good follow the money type story. Additionally, Ed has a lot of background writing about addiction and drug issues from some prior stories. And just on my part, as a reporter in a sort of smallish newsroom, partnering with another news organization is a good way to tackle some bigger projects. Next slide.
Great. Yeah. And so one of the things that has stuck with me about reporting on this for more than a year is why this money is coming. And the money is coming because bad things happened, and some people had worse things happen to them. Pam Keefe lost her daughter to a drug overdose. Since then, she's tried to keep people alive. She keeps harm reduction supplies in the trunk of her car, which you can see right there. She drives around handing them out to people, and she wants the money to go to getting people into housing and treatment, things like that, but not jails. She lives in a county with a district attorney who has been advocating for using the funds for law enforcement. And his argument is basically there's a real need for this and that taxpayers shouldn't have that burden. And this conflict over law enforcement and treatment, it's existed for a long time, but the opioid settlement money highlights it, and in some cases, it exacerbates it. Kate.
And just to give you some brief statistics, we had about over 5,000 drug overdose deaths here in 2022. The majority of those involve fentanyl. Pennsylvania is expecting more than $1 billion from some of the settlement funds that have been established so far. And this is different in every state, obviously, but in Pennsylvania, the bulk of that money is going to Pennsylvania's 67 counties. There's also a 15% allocation for counties that initiated litigation and other jurisdictions that initiated litigation. And then there's about 15% that's going to be controlled by the legislature and the governor as part of the state budget process. But when we first got started on this project, I had sort of mistakenly thought this was going to be a Harrisburg story, but it's really a 67 county story. Next slide. So how did we get started going about this? When we started on this road more than a year ago, there was not a lot of public information available. We sort of started by talking to some families of, impacted people, and Ed, from some of his previous reporting, had a lot of good contacts with those folks. We also early on made some inquiries to the Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs, which is a state agency. We reached out to provider groups that wanted to know about how these funds were going to be used. But very early on, there was no website. There was not really a lot of public information available about the trust that is overseeing this spending. And actually, we only learned about the first public meeting of the trust that was going to be taking place the day it was happening, when we got a tip from a lawmaker's staff member. Next slide. So our very first story, which we published about a year ago, highlighted some of the tensions that Ed mentioned between policing and treatment, and how much law enforcement spending is going to be permitted with this money. This, at the time, was a question many county officials had, and I would say, frankly, this issue is still somewhat unresolved and somewhat still being figured out now as we speak. And next slide.
Yeah. And so John Oliver, he had a segment on a show about a week or so ago about opioid settlement money. I definitely recommend checking it out. He cited a lot of reporting from a lot of journalists, including me and Kate. And he summed up the issue this way, that governments could attempt to justify almost any purchase. And we are seeing ongoing debate about what is allowed. And we're seeing, really broad interpretations of what it means to prevent opioid misuse. And one of the things that has stuck with me over the past year or so is something that Tricia Christensen, who was then with the community education group, told me, that it really comes down to how people in power decide to use their power. And so that led us to the natural next question of who has the power? And we looked into it. And what we found in Pennsylvania is that there's a 13-member oversight board. They get all PA's opioid settlement money first, then they distribute it. They're responsible for ensuring counties spend the money properly. They have the power to withhold and cut funding, and they make other financial decisions. But when we started looking into it, we learned they met in secret for months. Their committees have continued to meet in secret, and they didn't allow the public to attend in person until after we started reporting on some conflicts over that. They also don't allow the public to comment at their meetings. So there are just a number of ways they operate that block the public from participating in the process in ways that aren't typical of other state boards or local boards as well. So after we did that story, we heard from people who voiced frustration, including someone in New Jersey who talked about going through the same experience there. And she talked about how as the stakes get higher, so do the walls. And you might be wondering about state open records law, because I was wondering that early on in the process. The order creating the trust doesn't mention Pennsylvania's right to know law. And we have a state office of open records that settles a large majority of open records disputes, and they've ruled that they don't have jurisdiction over the trust. Even though in as part of that final determination process, chief counsel for that office said there are significant policy concerns supporting the claim the trust should be considered an agency subject to the right to know law, but the office said it's constrained by definitions under the law that were established by the General Assembly. Now, there are people who disagree with that interpretation. Terry Muchler, the first executive director of the office, she called it a huge mistake. And she also made the point that transparency can help with the healing process, that by engaging the public, you can empower them to feel better about how these decisions are being made. And Eric Arneson, the other former executive director of the office, he has talked about how this is a type of agency that should be covered, and given that it was determined they weren't, that it deserves greater scrutiny by lawmakers, or that the courts. But that hasn't happened yet. So right now, communications of the trust, contracts of the trust, and a whole host of other things of the trust aren't covered by the right to know law.
Okay, so where does this leave Ed and I? We're trying to inform the public. The trust isn't covered by our state's open records law, but luckily counties and local governments are covered by this law. So we knew that counties were going to have to file a report about their spending with the trust by March 15th. Ed had quite a bit of prior experience filing right to know requests with all 67 counties. So he was undaunted by this task. So what we ended up doing was we made a gigantic spreadsheet. We prepped our right to know request language so that it would be identical for all the counties. And then we, in one day, sent 77 right to know requests to all 67 counties and then also to the 10 district attorneys' offices who also got some of these funds. So, and how can you file 77 right to know requests in one day? Again, a giant spreadsheet. And then the requests started rolling in pretty quickly. We got about 36 reports within the initial few days after filing the requests. Only a couple counties denied us, but did provide them then on appeal. We've published more than 60 reports. And I should also mention at the outset, we had decided that when we obtained these requests, we wanted to make sure that we put them online so that these forms would be available to the public so that they could see, how did my county spend this money? And those have definitely been used, by other advocates and other reporters, and they are available to the general public.
And so when it came to presenting them, with Spotlight PA, we have more than 100 partners, so updating each of those websites would be virtually impossible every time we got a new report. We decided to use an embedded database. We used Data Wrapper, which according to its website has a free version that should give you access to a lot of the same tools. And we uploaded the documents to Document Cloud. And then sometimes we would redact like phone numbers and email addresses because they're generally not considered public under the right to know law in Pennsylvania in some circumstances, but some counties included them. And so we just decided to just redact them when possible. And then we would update the database. Sometimes we'd update it a few times a week when we got new reports coming in. And every time we republish the database, it would just automatically update on website. So this is how it is on WESA's website right now. It lists the last time we updated it. And I got to say, I've used this database pretty much daily. Like, I know I have all this stuff in my emails and my Google Drive, but this database is the easiest way for me to access these records. So it's been great just as a reporter as well. And one of the things, Kate talked about how some contacts in the, addiction world, people who worked in harm reduction, cared about some of those issues primarily. But there's been a wide variety of people who are affected by the opioid epidemic, obviously. And Kathleen Palm, she's a child welfare protection advocate in PA, very well known here. And she's been using the reports to sort of get a better understanding of how counties are prioritizing children and family issues like neonatal abstinence, trying to address neonatal abstinence syndrome. So it's just another reminder of the widespread impact of the opioid epidemic and how many people have an interest in how this money is spent.
So some tips from our experience, obviously, if you can speak with people who have firsthand experience with substance use and addiction and their families. In your state, carefully read what are your state's rules about distributing this money, as well as Exhibit E, if that applies. And then once you know what your state, how it's being distributed, compare to the best practices. And a good one, if you're not already aware, is the Johns Hopkins 5 principles. Consider partnering with other media to amplify the reach of your stories. And the opioid epidemic, as we all know, is very bleak and depressing. But this money does offer some hope. As we've said, it highlights some existing conflict about how to spend it, but it is an opportunity to, look at solutions.
Right, great. And so we've got some story ideas here. I'm not going to get into all of them right now. We'll have the slideshow available. And if people want to ask questions about it, we can get into that as well. But there are a ton of stories that can be and should be localized and are relevant in any state. And we also have a bunch of documents here that are good to request. Just there's so much ambiguity and disagreement about what documents mean in the opioid settlements. So getting the documents, getting the contracts, getting the grant applications are so important, always in journalism, but especially in this matter.
And just to end on somewhat of a hopeful note, a lack of transparency does not just create confusion amongst the general public, but sometimes among public officials as well. And we had a situation here in Allegheny County where we have a lot of very small municipalities, and we had a situation where the county was actually going to lose out on quite a bit of money because not every municipality had signed off on the settlement in the way they needed to do. We wrote about this situation. We highlighted and said, hey, this, this hasn't all, paperwork has not all been taken care of here. And guess what? After we highlighted it, the problem got fixed and the paperwork got signed, and the county did not have this considerable financial penalty. So I think this is, just shows that this is an area where the work of journalists can have a lot of impact.
All right, great. And then, so these are people who at one point turned dozens of my right to know requests into paper airplanes and tried to get them into a mailbox as part of an art exhibit. And so it was fun, it was informative, and I hope you can be inspired by their hard work. Now we'll take questions.
That was really wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a great photo. So folks, if you have questions for Kate and Ed, please drop them in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, that's welcome too. Let's start with Kylie in the chat. How did you split up the work or know that you wanted to work together? She's been thinking about doing similar work and has an idea of who she'd like to work with, but there were certain strengths that you or your outlets both had that helped during the process.
I would say in part, having previously partnered on childcare stories, which were like unrelated to this, was very useful in terms of just getting our editors to know each other, getting everybody used to partnering with each other, getting everybody used to working with each other. Because as Kate mentioned, Kate and I have pretty similar journalistic backgrounds. I think it's safe to say we both have covered the Capitol in Harrisburg. We both have I have a little bit of radio experience for a few years. Kate was a former print reporter, went to radio. And so we have similar backgrounds, but I think having that pre-established partnership sort of helped us know that it would be successful to partner on something more ambitious.
Yeah, definitely having worked together on a smaller thing was good. And also we sort of here at WESA kind of have a template for how to partner with other organizations, where we sort of at the outset say, okay, this is the editor from this organization and this is our editor here. And we also sort of, it's a little more complicated, honestly, for us because of being a radio organization. For every story, there's like a web component and there's also an audio component. So we have to, say from the outset, this is who's editing the audio, and this is how the web is getting edited. So we just sort of have a clear kind of process from the outset of who's doing what and some sort of little mini deadlines before we get to the big deadline of like, okay, we want the web done by this, then the fact, sort of here's the audio is done by this deadline. So it does help that we had done it before for sure on some smaller stories, because this has been a big story.
Yeah. And then I also say, just in terms of the actual right to know request, I mean, we We CC'd each other on pretty much all of those right to know requests, and sort of just to like make sure make sure we were all seeing the same thing. We would send a lot of, even though Kate was sending her batches of emails, she would CC me on them and just forward what she got there too. And yeah.
Also, just we geographically, like I was doing more in like the southwestern part of the state because that's sort of where my news organization is focused, but Ed is like a statewide, he has a statewide focus. So, he does sort of more of the stuff that's outside of, southwestern PA.
Yeah. And the last thing was that the partnership has been really beneficial, just not just in terms of like, WESA has been great to work with. And Kate's been great to work with, but it's also just spread the footprint. I mean, we've managed to like dive deep into some southwestern PA issues that really have statewide implications too.
Absolutely. So, if you all have other questions, please drop them in the chat. We have a few more minutes left to take questions. One here are there aspects of the information you received that were confusing or bureaucratically difficult to discern, and how did you deal with that? That's a great question.
That's a great question. I would say the benefit of these report, I mean, the whole interpretations of the opioid settlement has been, very evolving how people see it and what the rules are. And so really the benefit of these forms themselves is that they were uniform and that they were supposed to mean a certain thing. And, there are questions we have about whether there might have been, the typical typo mistakes on a form or misunderstandings on a form. But the benefit is just that they are very uniform. And so that was one way that these forms, I mean, because we've done a lot of right to know requests over the past year or so, and we've had a lot of battles over different ways and of tracking this money. And it can be challenging because not everything shows up in a meeting minutes. And so these forms are sort of like a standardized system. And so if you can find any standardized system, that just sort of helps with the reporting. I mean, one of the bureaucratic things was has been confusion and, about who has actually had to file these reports, and who actually has, there's counties that get money, there's litigating subdivisions that get money. The court order creating the trust has some, language about that would suggest litigating subdivisions have to file the reports too, but then another section, it doesn't say that. So there's been confusion within the court order that the state officials now say they're trying to clarify the next time they do one of these orders.
I will say also with these forms, some counties gave more detail than others in explaining their various programs. But also, we did just call up a lot of counties and ask, say, can you tell us about this? And a lot of them did.
Yeah. I mean, everybody we included in our reporting, we like ran it by them and said, we're understanding this correctly, right? Like even when people were just like, we mentioned a bunch of counties were using it for MAT, we're like, this is correct, right? This is what the form says. And so we gave them a chance to clarify that too.
Yeah. What kind of response, you talked about the mixed results from your reporting, that they're, the inclusion of this story that actually helped them claim money that they might not have gotten otherwise. So what about the response from the policymakers who kind of their decisions are the subject of this reporting? What have you all heard from them?
I think we've seen evolving uses of the funds. I mean, since earlier, we wrote about law enforcement early on, and we've seen some people get involved. In Lancaster County in particular, there was an advocate who I think has cited our reporting as getting involved there. And then, we've seen more debate happening there. We've also seen some greater clarity on some issues from the trust. And there's some other issues that we're reporting on currently too about reaction.
Yeah. So we do have time for one more question. In the meantime, I'm going to prompt everyone who is on the call that if you would like to sign up for our newsletter, that's where we'll be sending this recording out tomorrow. And of course, this was a conversation meant for journalists, but Kate and Ed, if I can ask you a little bit off topic, there are folks on this call who are activists in their communities, community leaders, policymakers. If they want to talk to a journalist and they want to help a journalist with these kinds of stories, what do you recommend their approach be?
I'll let you go first, Kate.
How to help a journalist? Wow. Great question. I mean, I guess, you know, reach out to your local newspaper, I suppose, or your, whatever local media might be covering this in your area. And I would say offer your point of view or your expertise on how you think the money should be spent, I suppose. Politely, and also understanding that many journalists are like kind of overwhelmed with a lot of, usually have a lot of balls in the air.
Yeah. I'll just say the more specific, the better. I mean, if you're going through the reports, if you're in Pennsylvania and you go through the reports we published, for instance, if you focus on one specific spending item, one program, and either if you have questions about it, you want to praise it, you want to criticize it, or just understand it more, the more specific you are, the easier it is to sort of for the journalist to then pursue it.
Absolutely. Those are both great tips. Well, Ed and Kate, thank you so, so much for your time today. Thank you to everybody who's joined this call or is maybe watching the recording later. Again, we share all of the links to these recordings, to story ideas with folks through our newsletter. So please sign up for that. That link is in the chat. You can also find more resources on our website at reportingonaddiction.org. And again, thanks everybody so much. It was great to see you, and we'll do another one of these here in a couple of months. Keep an eye on your inbox.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.